Welcome to You're Not Broken, Just Rewiring, a free audiobook podcast by me, Glenn Ostlund. Chapter 15, Atlantis and the Neuron that Dreamed Itself Awake. Is it just me, or does self-awareness sometimes feel like a fall from grace? One moment, everything just is. Breath, light, contact. The world hums in a kind of coherence. Simple, silent, enough. And then, suddenly, there's a mirror. There's an I. There's a question, what am I? And with that question, the ache begins. We call it awakening, but it might also be fragmentation. If Lemuria was the age of interoceptive coherence, a cellular Eden where felt sense led the way, then Atlantis was the age of neural emergence. Consciousness stepping outside itself to behold itself. The rise of reflection, the rise of identity, and eventually, the rise of ego. In this chapter, we're going to explore the myth of Atlantis, not simply as a tale of a sunken civilization, but as a mirror held up to the nervous system itself. We'll examine how three different esoteric traditions, Ra's transmissions in the Law of One, Helena Blavatsky's vision in The Secret Doctrine, and the psychic readings of Edgar Cayce, each frame Atlantis as a moment of transition, power, and collapse. Then, we'll lay these perspectives alongside the story that science tells about the emergence of neurons, the centralization of the brain, and the delicate rise of human consciousness. The goal is not to determine what really happened in physical history, but to examine what these stories reflect in functional reality. How civilizations rise and fall in the body. How ego forms in the mind. And how memory, biological, cultural, or spiritual, carries patterns that repeat. Atlantis, in this sense, becomes less about a place and more about a process. And that process lives in you. The Atlantean thread, Ra's perspective. In the raw material, Atlantis is not a mere fable or philosophical parable. It is a memory, a spiritual event, a chapter in a longer evolutionary curriculum. According to Ra, a sixth-density social memory complex that claims to speak from a collective consciousness formed on Venus, Atlantis was one of several civilizations that rose on Earth during what Ra calls the third density, a stage of soul development where beings become self-aware and capable of choosing a polarity, service to self or service to other. Ra describes Atlantis as beginning more than 30,000 years ago as a slowly developing agrarian society, rooted in cooperation and spiritual simplicity. But around 15,000 years ago, a great shift occurred. The Atlanteans discovered ways to harness what Ra calls intelligent energy, a subtle force derived from the indigo ray, associated with the pineal gland and higher levels of perception. With this energy, they developed advanced crystal technology, systems of healing, and tools for manipulating the physical world in ways that bordered on the miraculous. In the beginning, this knowledge was used for service and alignment with what Ra calls the Law of One, a fundamental principle of unity underlying all of existence. But polarity began to split. Some Atlanteans, drawn by ego, hierarchy, and personal power, began to divert this knowledge toward control. Technologies meant for healing were weaponized. Crystals became engines of destruction. A spiritual elite, once devoted to teaching and service, fractured under the pressure of fear and dominance. The confederation of benevolent beings, of which Ra was a part, attempted to intervene by offering guidance and further teachings. But these efforts, Ra admits with remorse, were naive. The knowledge they shared was quickly co-opted by those aligned with service to self, and the balance tipped toward chaos. What followed was not a singular catastrophe, but a series of escalating imbalances. Around 11,000 years ago, Ra reports, the first great conflict erupted. Nearly half the population was lost, as energy weapons disintegrated bodies and shattered landscapes. Then came a final conflict, a little over 10,000 years ago, what Ra describes as an earth-changing configuration. The Atlanteans had lost touch with the resonance that once held them together. Their civilization drowned beneath the sea, not as punishment, but as consequence. And yet, some remembered. Ra tells of 3 groups of positively oriented Atlanteans who foresaw the fall and escaped to the mountains of Peru, the highlands of Tibet, and the ridges of what is now Turkey. These survivors carried fragments of Atlantean wisdom into the future, seeding cultures that would echo their knowledge in myth, symbol, and sacred geometry. Ra does not frame Atlantis as a cautionary tale. It is part of a curriculum, a dense and difficult lesson in what happens when consciousness grows faster than compassion, when the power of mind surpasses the coherence of heart. Blavatsky's vision, the 4th root race. For Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical movement and author of The Secret Doctrine, Atlantis is more than a lost continent. It is an evolutionary epoch. She places the Atlanteans as the 4th root race, in a cycle of 7, each representing a stage in the progressive descent of spirit into matter, and the eventual ascent back to spirit again. Atlantis, in this framework, was not a single island, but a vast landmass stretching across what we now call the Atlantic Ocean, lasting for hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of years. Blavatsky's Atlanteans began as enormous beings, part ethereal, part material, beings of great psychic sensity and elemental command. They were the inheritors of Lemurian fluidity, but stood on the cusp of embodiment. As they evolved, they became more solid, more mental, more individuated. This descent into materiality was not a punishment, but a necessary densification of spirit. Yet with it came the seeds of corruption. The early Atlanteans were guided by adepts of the good law, masters of balance and spiritual discipline. But over time, a new priesthood emerged. Those who sought power over others rather than alignment with the divine. These sorcerers, later referred to as the Lords of the Dark Face, began to manipulate elemental forces for personal gain. They created monstrous hybrids, subjugated nature spirits, and bent magic to their own designs. According to Blavatsky, their fall was karmic and systemic. Civil wars erupted between the sons of light and the sons of the shadow. The elemental forces they had once harmonized turned against them, and then came the floods. Blavatsky speaks of multiple inundations, phases of geological and psychic collapse, each erasing portions of Atlantean civilization until only the final island, Poseidonus, remained. When it, too, sank beneath the sea, the fourth root race ended, and the fifth, the so-called Aryan root race, began. But echoes of Atlantis lingered in the architecture and myths of Egypt, India, Central America, and even Easter Island. Blavatsky's narrative is less concerned with physical history than with energetic memory. Atlantis, she says, is the turning point when humanity shifted from instinctual knowing to mental abstraction, from resonance to reason, from Lemuria's song to Atlantis's mirror. Casey's Atlantis: Technology, Polarity, and Soul Memory. Edgar Cayce, the American mystic known as the Sleeping Prophet, offered a deeply personal version of the Atlantis story. In hundreds of trance readings conducted between the 1920s and 1940s, Cayce described Atlantis as a technologically advanced civilization with roots stretching back over 200,000 years. He claimed that many of his clients were reincarnated Atlanteans, now living out karmic echoes of the choices they had once made. Cayce's Atlantis is vibrant, structured, and divided. He speaks of three major periods of destruction: the first around 50,000 BCE, the second near 28,000 BCE, and the final sinking just over 10,000 years ago. At its height, Atlantean society had mastered airships, energy crystals, and devices capable of transmitting force over great distances. The central object of power was the Tuawi stone, or firestone, a great crystal that could focus solar and cosmic energies for healing, agriculture, and eventually warfare. But it wasn't technology that doomed Atlantis. It was orientation. Cayce described two primary factions: the sons of the Law of One, who lived in alignment with divine unity, and the sons of Belial, who pursued domination, materialism, and self-interest. The conflict between them was moral, spiritual, and deeply familiar. The sons of the Law of One advocated for the spiritual upliftment of all beings, including subhuman things that had been genetically engineered or spiritually devolved. The sons of Belial saw these beings as resources, tools to be used, controlled, or discarded. The final destruction of Atlantis, according to Casey, came when the Belial faction misused the Firestone's power. A catastrophic energy surge disrupted the Earth's magnetic balance, triggering earthquakes, floods, and volcanic eruptions that swallowed the last remnants of the land. Casey did not present this as myth, but as memory, encoded in the soul, in the body, in the very nervous systems of those returning to Earth to finish what they had started. And in a chilling parallel, Casey warned that Atlanteans were returning. He spoke of 20th century America as a reawakening of Atlantean souls, repeating their patterns of innovation, fragmentation, and ethical crisis. The lesson, he insisted, was not to fear technology, but to match it with spiritual coherence. Atlantis, he said, will rise again, not physically, but within. The question is whether we will remember why it fell. The biological Atlantis, nervous systems and the fall into form. Long before any crystal-powered empires, long before words were spoken or myths were formed, the biological world was quietly assembling the architecture for what we now call human waking consciousness. In the grand spiral of Earth's evolution, the emergence of neurons was as revolutionary as the splitting of the atom, and perhaps just as dangerous. If Lemuria was the poetry of cellular coherence, Atlantis was the syntax of neural complexity. For billions of years, life on Earth existed without neurons. Microbes communicated chemically, sending small molecules to signal stress, attraction, or defense. Even simple multicellular organisms like sponges could respond to their environment through slow, diffusion-based signaling. Cells would secrete chemicals, and nearby cells would detect them. An elegant but sluggish form of conversation, like sending smoke signals across a valley. These early life forms were relational, responsive, alive, but they could not coordinate across distance. They could not remember, or anticipate, or reflect. Then, about 600 million years ago, something changed. In the warm shallows of Precambrian seas, the first true nerve cells appeared. A neuron is unlike any other cell in the body, long, thin, and specialized for speed. It doesn't just pass along a chemical message, it electrifies it. Neurons generate and transmit electrical impulses down axons, sometimes several feet long, and communicate across synapses using neurotransmitters that spark the next cell into action. This shift from slow chemical seepage to rapid electrochemical signaling was monumental. It was as if the body discovered lightning. A single organism could now coordinate muscle contractions, escape predators, and respond to touch, all within milliseconds. A living body became a system of instantaneous communication. Sensation was no longer confined to the place it occurred. It could be relayed, integrated, remembered. The earliest creatures with nerve nets, jellyfish, sea anemones, developed diffuse webs of neurons that allowed their tentacles to respond to environmental changes. But these were still primitive structures. What emerged next, as organisms became more complex and mobile, was the clustering of neurons into ganglia, and eventually into central nervous systems. This centralization marked a turning point. It wasn't just that an organism could sense danger. It could now process that information, compare it to past experience, and choose a response. By the time of the Cambrian explosion, about 540 million years ago, Earth's oceans were teeming with innovation. Eyes evolved independently multiple times. Organisms developed antennae, specialized appendages, and complex movement patterns. Trilobites had compound eyes. Primitive fish had spinal cords. Worms could burrow, hunt, or retreat, all governed by increasingly intricate neural maps. This was the biological Atlantis, a sudden flourishing of intelligence and adaptability, written in electrochemical code. It was not a mythic continent. It was a neural renaissance. And, just like the Atlantis described by Ra, Blavatsky, and Casey, this burst of advancement carried both beauty and danger. With the ability to model the world came the risk of mistaking that model for reality. With speed came the possibility of overreaction. With memory came fear. And with complexity came the need for integration, or the consequence of collapse. As life moved onto land and evolved through amphibians, reptiles, and eventually mammals, the nervous system continued its upward spiral. Specialized brain regions emerged. The limbic system brought emotional salience, fear, bonding, desire. The neocortex introduced abstraction, logic, and language. And then, in the relatively recent past, the prefrontal cortex arrived on the scene. This thin layer of brain tissue, just behind your forehead, gave rise to what many call the hallmark of human consciousness, metacognition, the ability to think about your own thoughts, to imagine a future, to tell yourself stories about who you are, who others are, and what it all means. So take a moment now, pause, and thank your neurons. Because everything you're experiencing right now, whether you're reading these words on a page or hearing them spoken aloud, is only possible because of them. The message isn't entering your consciousness directly. It is being translated. If you are reading, light strikes your retina, electrical signals travel through the optic nerve into the visual cortex, where shapes are distinguished, letters recognized, words assembled. If you are listening, sound waves vibrate the tiny bones of your middle ear, sending ripples through the cochlea, where hair cells transduce vibration into electrical signals that travel via the auditory nerve to your temporal lobes. In either case, the information activates networks across the left hemisphere, where language, memory, and emotion converge. Your limbic system determines how much it matters. Your prefrontal cortex tries to make sense of it all. And beneath it all, your autonomic nervous system is constantly adjusting your breathing, your heartbeat, your posture, your sense of safety or threat. You are not simply reading or hearing. You are translating, evaluating, embodying. You are responding, even now. This is not a small thing. This is the miracle of being a nervous system aware of itself. But even this miracle is built on illusion. Neuroscientist Anil Seth calls consciousness a controlled hallucination, a best guess your brain generates based on incomplete data. Philosopher Thomas Nagel famously asked, "What is it like to be a bat?" The point of his question wasn't to valorize bats. It was to remind us that experience is perspectival. A bat, using echolocation rather than vision, constructs a radically different model of the world. It doesn't see edges, it hears them. Its universe is built from bounce and reverb, from spatialized sound, and it is real for the bat, just as your model of the world, shaped by sight, language, and memory, is real for you. But it is still a model. This, too, is Atlantis. The moment a system stops simply reacting and begins representing, building internal worlds based on sensory input, memory, and prediction. The neuron is not just a messenger, it is a dreamer. It sketches possibilities. It tells stories. It makes meaning out of sensation. And with that gift comes great vulnerability, because the model can become mistaken for the truth. As the brain grows in complexity, the mirror neuron system emerges. Discovered in the early 1990s in macaque monkeys, mirror neurons fire not only when we act, but when we witness another act. These neurons form the bedrock of empathy, imitation, and shared attention. They allow us to read faces, intuit emotions, and simulate the experience of others. But they also open the door to shame, envy, and projection. When we internalize judgment, it's the mirror neurons that burn. When we feel excluded, it's not just a thought, it's a neural echo of abandonment. So again, we meet Atlantis, not as a city of stone, but as a fragile, brilliant network of connections inside the skull. A system capable of beauty and horror, a mind that can imagine utopias and engineer genocide, a nervous system that can simulate futures never lived and resurrect traumas long past, a civilization of neurons, 80 billion strong, each with thousands of connections, lighting up and going dark in patterns too complex to fully comprehend. And just as Atlanteans in Casey's and Ra's accounts misused the energy of their time, the modern human nervous system can misuse its own complexity. The prefrontal cortex, meant to model the world, can override the body's signals. The storyteller inside the skull can drown out the whispers of the heart, the gut, the breath. Thought becomes tyrant. Narrative becomes loop. The system forgets that it is more than mind. It is a body, a field, a resonance. When that happens, when the mind becomes untethered from the body, the result is not insight, it is dissociation. The floodwaters of Atlantis return as anxiety, shutdown, fragmentation. In psychoneuroimmunology, we see how chronic stress disables the immune system, how trauma deregulates the vagus nerve, how early attachment wounds imprint patterns of hypervigilance and numbness. In systems theory, we see how feedback loops, once adaptive, become rigid and self-destructive when coherence is lost. We see a nervous system trying to preserve itself by retreating from itself. But the story doesn't end there, because unlike mythic Atlantis, which disappears forever beneath the sea, your nervous system can remember. It can return. It can find its rhythm again, through breath, through connection, through safe relationships and soft attention, through conscious rewiring. Science, like mythology, reminds us a nervous system out of balance doesn't need punishment. It needs pause. It needs coherence. It needs, quite literally, a reset. You are the spiral. So, what if we read these esoteric texts not as revelations from other worlds, but as poetic neuroscience? What if Ra's densities are metaphors for developmental states? What if Blavatsky's root races are evolutionary layers of nervous system emergence? What if Casey's soul migrations are ancestral memories encoded in our genes, our bodies, our dreams? What if Atlantis is in you, not as a past life, but as a present pattern? You are the civilization of light and knowledge. You are the crystal technology of your own mind. You are the polarity split between service and survival. You are the flood, and you are the memory of coherence that precedes it. When you override your own signals, when your internal narrator drowns out your body's truth, when shame silences the breath, Atlantis sinks again. But when you pause, when you feel, when you remember resonance before narration, the island rises, not in geography, but in nervous system function, in coherence, in care. Ra says you're learning to choose your polarity. Blavatsky says you're moving from form to formlessness and back again. Casey says your past is alive in you, asking to be redeemed. Biology says you are a network of communicating cells, constantly rewiring, constantly healing, constantly integrating. These are not contradictions. They are translations. And perhaps integration itself is nothing more than remembering that all of these stories, scientific, mystical, mythical, are different languages trying to describe the same thing. A system that once fell apart, now learning how to come back together. Because you're not broken. You are rewiring. Always. Postscript. The fifth root race and the path ahead. Before we move forward, at the edge of what may become a great reunion, we need to pause and tend to a fracture still pulsing beneath the surface of our language. The word Aryan. In The Secret Doctrine, Helena Blavatsky used the term to describe what she called the fifth root race, a symbolic stage of human evolution marked by the full emergence of ego consciousness and the rise of systems, reason, and identity. Her use drew from older linguistic roots. Arya, often translated from the ancient Indo-European language as noble or pure. But the form of the word, like so many others throughout history, was later weaponized. It was seized, distorted, and made into something brutal. Twisted by fascist regimes and supremacist ideologies, the word Aryan became a banner for dominance, eugenics, and genocide. It became a mask for fear and control. This is not incidental. It cannot be sidestepped. Language carries memory, and memory carries wounds. Any attempt to use the term today, especially without deep context, can activate real pain. And so we must acknowledge this distortion, not to defend it, but to metabolize it, to digest what was poisoned, to separate the function from the form. Because beneath that corrupted outer shell still lives a metaphor worth redeeming, not for bloodlines or hierarchies, but for consciousness. The so-called fifth root race, as Blavatsky envisioned it, was never about race in any genetic or political sense. It was a symbolic phase in the development of human awareness, an era when the ego grew strong enough to name, to define, to stabilize experience through story. It was the birth of the mapmaker, the legislator, the narrator, a time when chaos was made coherent through systems. But over time, those systems hardened. Stories, once fluid and adaptive, became rigid scripts. Institutions calcified. The ego, which once served to organize life for the body, began to serve only itself, looping, guarding, defending. Identity became division, separation took root. Now as we spiral forward, we're offered a new choice. Not to destroy the ego, but to soften it, to let narrative become relational again, to allow structure to yield to soul. The next root race, if we dare to use that metaphor, may not be a race at all, but a form of being that can feel without fear, a nervous system that can stay, a story that reconnects. Let's spiral on.